300,000 years ago, there were at least 6 kinds of human alive on Earth at the same time. There was us, there were Neanderthals, there were Denisovans, there was a 3.5-foot species on an Indonesian island, and a small-brained one in a South African cave, and another on Luzon that nobody had heard of until 2019. Today, there is one, and nobody can tell you for certain why it's this one. Let's start with the ones we know best, because for most of the last 2 centuries, they were the only others we knew about at all. The first Neanderthal skeleton was identified in 1856 in a limestone quarry in Germany. The workers thought it was a bear. What they had found was a species that lived across Europe and Western Asia for something like 350,000 years. That is more than twice as long as our species has existed. We got them wrong for about 100 years. The hunched, shuffling caveman comes from a single reconstruction published in 1911, based on one skeleton belonging to a man with severe arthritis. That image stayed in textbooks for decades. Here is what they actually were. Neanderthals had brains slightly larger than ours on average. They made fire on demand, they made stone tools with multiple components, and they made glue by heating birch bark to a temperature that has to be controlled within a narrow range, or the whole thing fails. They collected pigment. They wore feathers and eagle talons in a way that has no practical use anyone can identify. In Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found the remains of a man who had lost the use of one arm, was blind in one eye, and had a severe injury to his leg. The bones show he lived for years afterward. Someone was feeding him. They buried their dead. Not always, and there is still argument about how often, but they did it. They were not a rough draft of us. They were a different, fully developed way of being a human being, running in parallel with ours for hundreds of thousands of years. And then, roughly 40,000 years ago, they stopped. But the Neanderthals are the ones we can see. The next one we almost couldn't find at all. In 2008, in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a team recovered a fragment of a finger bone. It was small enough to sit on a fingertip. It came from a girl, and it was about 50,000 years old. Nobody could tell what she was by looking at her, so they sequenced it. The work was done by a team including Svante Pääbo, whose lab had already reconstructed the Neanderthal genome, and in 2010 they published the result in Nature. The finger did not belong to a modern human. It did not belong to a Neanderthal. It belonged to a population that had split from the Neanderthal line hundreds of thousands of years earlier, and had been out there the entire time. Nobody had known they existed. This is worth sitting with. We identified an entire kind of human from a piece of bone the size of a fingernail before we had any real idea what their face looked like. We have a handful of teeth. We have a jawbone from a cave on the Tibetan plateau. We have a genome. That is close to everything. They were not a small footnote. Their DNA turns up across Asia and out into the Pacific, which means they were spread across an enormous stretch of the planet for a very long time. And in 2018, the same cave produced something else. A bone fragment from a girl who was about 13 when she died. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan, not distant ancestry, her parents. Out of the small number of ancient individuals we have ever sequenced, one of them was a first-generation hybrid of 2 different kinds of human. That tells you something about how often it must have been happening. So we have one species we can see and one we can only read. And then there are the ones we can't explain at all. In 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists dug into the floor of a cave called Liang and found an adult woman about 3.5 feet tall with a brain roughly a third the size of yours. Full grown. Not a child, not a modern human with a medical condition, and there are now remains from multiple individuals. She used stone tools. There is evidence of fire in the cave. Islands do this. Large animals that get stranded on them tend to shrink over generations, because a smaller body needs less food. It happened to elephants. On Flores, it appears to have happened to a human being. In 2019, another one turned up. A few teeth and foot bones from Calao Cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, describing a species nobody had ever seen before, with a strange mix of ancient and modern features. And then there is the chamber. In a cave system in South Africa, there is a room that can only be reached by crawling through a vertical chute about 7 inches wide at its narrowest point. The excavation team had to be recruited specifically for being small enough to fit. Inside that room are the remains of at least 15 individuals with brains around a third the size of ours. Men, women, children, infants, they were alive as recently as 250,000 years ago, which means they overlapped with the earliest members of our own species. There are no predator marks on the bones. There is no sediment pattern suggesting a flood washed them in. There is no evidence they lived in that chamber, and almost no other animal remains down there with them. Nobody has a settled explanation for how 15 bodies ended up at the bottom of a chute you can barely fit a shoulder through. One reading is that something carried them there on purpose. That claim is heavily disputed, and the argument is still going. So look at the timeline. The last of the strange island species disappears somewhere around 50,000 years ago. The Neanderthals go around 40,000. The Denisovans fade out of the genetic record in roughly the same window. For 300,000 years, there were several. Within a few tens of thousands of years, there was one. That is fast. And the obvious explanation is the one almost everyone reaches for. We were smarter, we showed up, we outthought them, and we wiped them out. That is not what the evidence shows. There is no layer of massacre sites. There is no line of Neanderthal skeletons with our weapons in them. And they were not primitive. The fire, the glue, the pigment, the burials, the brains. A species does not survive 350,000 years of European winters by being slow. What the genetics actually show is smaller and much less satisfying. Neanderthal populations were tiny and scattered. Their genomes show very low diversity, which is what you see in a species that has been living in small, isolated groups for a long time. Small populations are fragile. A bad century of climate, a disease, a run of poor breeding seasons, and a group simply doesn't come back. Then a much larger population arrives, moving in numbers, and the two groups interbreed, which we know for certain that they did. You don't need a war for that to end one way. If one population is 10 times the size of the other, and they keep having children together, the smaller one doesn't get destroyed. It gets absorbed. They may not have lost. They may have been outnumbered until there was nothing left that was distinctly them. That is the best current reading, and it is genuinely contested. The honest answer to what happened to the other humans is that we are still arguing about it, with the evidence still coming out of the ground. But there is one part that isn't in dispute. If your ancestry is not entirely African, somewhere between 1% and 2% of your DNA came from Neanderthals. If your family comes from parts of Southeast Asia or the Pacific, you carry Denisovan DNA on top of that, and in some populations it runs several percent. That is not a curiosity. Those genes are doing things right now. Some of them affect how your immune system responds to infection. One Denisovan variant, common in Tibet, changes how the body handles low oxygen at high altitude. Researchers have linked Neanderthal variants to how sensitive your nerves are to pain and to whether you naturally wake up early or stay up late. The hour you fell asleep last night may not be entirely your own decision. Somewhere back there, someone in your direct line met a person who was not quite the same kind of person and had a child, and that child lived. And then it happened again, and again, for long enough that a piece of them is sitting in every cell you have. They are gone. Part of them isn't. For 300,000 years, there were at least 6 kinds of human on this planet, and now there is one, and we don't know why it's us. There's one of us left. We're just carrying the others.